Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 2026 Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy, Philip J. Bowman Lecture on Race and Policy. We are so excited to have you here with us. My name is Amanda Lewis, and I mostly joyfully serve as the director of IRRPP. Phil Bowman was the founding director of the Institute. That's who this lecture series is named after. He usually joins us for these. He is very sorry he couldn't be here today because he's having some health challenges. But I do always like to take at least a moment to say that for those of us who were lucky enough to know Phil, he has had a really strong imprint on many of our careers. He has mentored hundreds of folks, scholars all across the country. He was always and continues to be a model of ethical and courageous leadership, and we are very proud to have him as part of IRRPP's legacy. A few brief housekeeping things. We have a videographer present, that's Ray back there, and we will be taking photos throughout the event. The recording of the event today will be made available on our website and YouTube channel. Give us a few weeks to get that up and ready. We have a person providing part and captioning services over here on my left, if you need them. Call and response books. We'll be selling books after the event. Much thanks to them. They're in the hallway, so please do buy some books afterwards. We also welcome you to stay for a brief reception just outside of this room following the end of the event, so please stick around and eat a bit. We are anticipating, we always have too much food, so we bring little to-go things, so you should feel free to take some to-go. It's part of our hallmark. For our Q&A portion of the evening, we ask that you write a question on a note card. You should have been handed one coming in. If you weren't, just wave at any point, and Yvonne Arenas, who's standing in the middle back there, or Dima Lewis, or other folks will have them, so just wave and they'll bring you one, and then they'll pick them up along the way. Okay. It is really a joy to see you all here and have you as part of our extended community. We at IRRPP work hard to build genuine and inclusive community and to create spaces that invite everyone to bring their full humanity. We do this in big and small ways. In big gatherings like today, we want to say welcome. We really do mean it. We're thrilled to have you all here, and we're very excited for this conversation. In addition, in trying to honor the space and our desire to be generous with each other and gracious in these turbulent times, and in the spirit of building community, this is, what did you call it, Dina? What did you call it? This, what I'm about to do, you called it, yeah, no. We just want to take 30 seconds, I know, poor Dina, and ask you, take 30 seconds and ask you to introduce yourself to one or two people that are sitting around you who you don't know. Turn around, just say hello, just find your You can continue the conversation during the reception afterwards. Thank you. Thank you for indulging us. I'll remember what the word was later. Thank you. I'd like to introduce the Provost of the University of Illinois Chicago, Karen Colley, who will give some opening remarks. Karen has a long and distinguished career, which I will only briefly touch on. Dr. Colley joined UIC in 1991 and has been recognized as a University of Illinois University Scholar, the highest designation for a faculty member within the University of Illinois systems. She has been serving as Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs since 2023, and she also served as the Dean of the Graduate School for over a dozen years before that, a decade at least. where she focused on her efforts on supporting historically underserved and underrepresented students during that transition into graduate school and beyond. Throughout her career, including her time as provost, she has been a stalwart advocate of UIC's commitments to equity and access, and has been a longtime supporter of IRRPP, and we're very glad to have her here today. Thank you, Karen.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Amanda, for the intro. Don't follow introduction. I am so delighted to welcome you to the annual Bowman Lecture. This is one of my favorite things to do each year, and sadly, this is going to be my last time. And I love the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy, and I want to recognize Amanda for her incredible leadership and the entire IRRPP team for their extraordinary work. I also want to thank the event's co-sponsors, the Arab American Cultural Center, the Global Middle East Studies Minor, and the Social Justice Initiative for helping bring this important conversation to our campus. Events like the Bowman Lecture reflects something that is deeply central to UIC's equity-focused mission and inclusive values. As a public research university, located in one of the most diverse cities in the country, we have both an opportunity and a responsibility to create spaces where complex issues can be examined thoughtfully, rigorously, and with intellectual honesty. Universities must be places where complex conversations can occur, where scholarship, historical analysis, lived experience, and diverse perspectives come together to deepen our understanding and shape policies. And that is precisely the role that IRRPP plays at UIC. For more than 25 years, IRRPP has advanced scholarship that confronts the structural roots of racial and ethnic inequality while connecting that research to real-world policy challenges. The Institute has become a national model for how universities can bridge research, community engagement, and policy making. And through its work, IRRPP has elevated conversations that too often remain at the margins, bringing data and evidence and scholarly rigor to public debates about racial inequity, justice, the policies that shape housing, education, health, and economic opportunity. These efforts are part of a much larger legacy. And as most of you know, because maybe you were at the celebration, IRRPP recently marked its 25th anniversary. A full century of scholarship, partnership, and dialogue focused on issues that shape Chicago, our nation, and our world. And again, the Institute's work reminds us that rigorous research can shed light on inequities, inform solutions, and strengthen conversations that help our communities and democracies move forward. Today's Bowman Lecture continues that tradition by bringing us together to engage with an issue that has profound historical, political, and human dimensions. I'm going to mess your names up, even though we talked, and I'm going to say it wrong. I'll figure it out. We are honored to welcome Rashid Khalidi. No, it's Khalidi, yes. A distinguished historian of modern Middle East and Palestine, whose scholarship has helped shape global understanding of the region's history of politics. We're also honored to welcome Dima Khalidi, an attorney and civil rights advocate whose work focuses on protecting constitutional rights and ensuring that advocacy and debate around Palestinian issues can occur freely in the United States. At a time when global conflicts and questions of justice are intensely debated, it is especially important that universities serve as spaces where people can engage thoughtfully with history, scholarship, and lived experience. Conversations like this one will help deepen our understanding of the human historical and political dynamics that shape struggles for justice and self-determination and encourage us to reflect on them with nuance, empathy, and intellectual rigor. I am so very proud that UIC is a place where diverse perspectives and historically marginalized voices can and should be heard. Our values as an institution call us to bring together all of these things: scholarship, historical inquiries, and lived experiences of people from many backgrounds to foster dialogue and mutual understanding. By listening, learning, and engaging across differences, we deepen our understanding of the complex world we share and help create the conditions for a more hopeful future, one in which justice, human rights, and human dignity are more fully realized. So it's really fantastic to see the crowd here today, and welcome again. And now I'm going to hand things back over to Amanda. Thank you.
Okay. I want to start by acknowledging that we are currently in the midst of immensely troubling times. We are witnessing and or ourselves experiencing genocide, ongoing violence, war, and growing authoritarianism at home. It is a time for deep reflection and for informed organizing and action. In this time, we are immensely grateful for our many local partners who we learn from and collaborate with regularly, and to those scholars and organizers that we turn to for knowledge, energy, and inspiration. Speaking of inspiration, over 25 years ago, when I had just moved to Chicago with my partner, Taryn Foreman, we were invited to Bill and Bernadine's house for dinner one night. And at their table were their dear friends, Rashid and Dima Khalidi. They were warm and welcoming and brilliant, as will surprise no one. And after the dinner, I immediately went out and got one of Rashid's books and started reading. And Tyrone actually reached out to Rashid about sitting in on his class at the University of Chicago, where he was teaching at the time, and spent the next semester learning from him. It is such a joy for me to be part of bringing him and his family to campus for this event. Rashid Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor Emeritus of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. He taught at Lebanese University, the American University of Beirut, and the University of Chicago before going on to Columbia. He was president of the Middle East Studies Association and was co-editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies. He served as an advisor to the Palestinian delegation to the Madrid and Washington Arab-Israeli peace negotiations from October 1991 until June 1993. He's the author of 8 books, including The 100 Years' War on Palestine. As I said, we'll be selling several of them outside, so please take a look. His daughter, but also immense intellectual on her own accord, Dima Khalidi is the founder and director of Palestine Legal, an organization dedicated to protecting the Constitution and civil rights of people speaking out for Palestinian freedom in the U.S. She founded the organization based on the understanding that grassroots movements are what create transformative change, and that movement lawyers have a critical role to play to protect and advance organizing on the ground, especially in the face of backlash from the defenders of the status quo. She has over 2 decades of experience as a lawyer, educator, writer, and advocate. So the order here is that we will first hear from Rashid, and then they will be in conversation, and then we will have questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be back in Chicago, where we spent 16 very happy years. It's a pleasure to see so many friendly faces in the audience. And I want to thank Amanda, I want to thank Dina, I want to thank Provost Khalidi, I want to thank IRRPP for bringing me here, both to speak to you and to have a chance to see 2 of my grandchildren. So that's the real reason I came. I'm going to talk this evening. I'll try and talk for no more than half an hour. Once I get going, sometimes it's hard to stop me, but I'll do my best. I want to talk today about some of the historical background to the horrors that we're seeing in the Middle East today, specifically with regard to Palestine. But Palestine is the key to many of these horrors, unfortunately. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the book. I will explain how I think that's linked to these things. This is a book I wrote almost 6 years. Well, I wrote more than 6 years ago. It was published almost 6 years ago. And the title was The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance. And I want to go through that title and break it down and explain why I think the title highlights the really important aspects of what we've been seeing in Palestine, in Israel, in the region for more than 100 years. I wrote this book because I grew up, about half of my life was spent in this country and half of my life in the Middle East and elsewhere. And I was intensely aware from a very young age of the degree to which the history of Palestine is distorted, is manipulated, is basically ignored to a very large extent. I grew up reading, may God forgive me, the New York Times from a very young age. Fortunately, young people no longer pay any attention to that rag. A lot of older people, unfortunately, still do. And it is still the paper of record. And it was from that I learned that the reality that I heard about and had learned about and had grown up with through my parents and through spending time in the Middle East was completely unknown to most Americans. It was blotted out by a version of reality which was made up of distortion, fantasy, lies, and another entirely different narrative that actually in many cases was true but had nothing to do with Palestine. A narrative that had to do with Jewish history, or a narrative that had to do with the Holocaust, or a narrative that had to do with a variety of other things, but which had nothing to do with the lived experience of the population of Palestine, the people of Palestine, the history of that country, up until very recently. So I wrote the book out of a desire to respond to all of these distortions. And with that title, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, I had specific intentions. I called this a war on Palestine. This has been a war waged on the people of Palestine by the great powers in the first instance, and only secondarily by the Zionist movement and later the State of Israel. And everything that that movement and everything that that state has done has been backed by the great powers. And I explain that in the book. I try to explain that in the book. I specified, moreover, that it started in 1917. There are important elements of this war, of this conflict, that go back before that. The founding of the Zionist movement goes back to 1897. The first Zionist Congress in Basel. The growth of Palestinian nationalism goes back before 1917. But I specified that date because I wanted to establish that the series of events that we are still watching today in Palestine and in neighboring countries started with the advent of British colonialism in Palestine in 1917. The Balfour Declaration, Britain's occupation of Palestine in that year, started the events that we see today. In that region, in that place, up to that time, things were entirely different. Even though you already had an incipient conflict between the Zionist movement and the Palestinians. What we see today is a function of the arrival of Britain on the scene, is a function of the Balfour Declaration, is a function of the mandate for Palestine which the British imposed, is a function of the things that the British did and that later other great powers did. This is not a conflict that has been going on since time immemorial. Our illiterate, ahistorical politicians repeat that mindless statement, time immemorial. It's been going on for centuries. The president has been saying that, for example, speaking of mindless illiterates. But it has not Go back to 1917, go back to 1817, go back to 1717, 1617, 1517, go back hundreds of years. There was no conflict between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. None whatsoever. Never was there a conflict in Palestine between these two peoples or their forerunners. Nothing. Crusaders and Muslims, yes. Great powers and of various sorts in Palestine, yes. But a Jewish-Arab conflict? Never. Absolutely not at any point in history was there any such thing. This is not a conflict that's been going on since time immemorial. This is not an age-old conflict between Arabs and Jews. And it's really important to state that. This war is entirely a product of four factors. The first is the eruption of imperialism into the Middle East, specifically the British occupation of Palestine and many other areas in 1917 and 1918. This is still true today, that it is imperialism that is driving regional wars. It's the United States and Israel that attacked Iran only 2 weeks ago, less than 2 weeks ago. That's the first factor. The second factor is the rise of nation-state nationalisms, which you didn't have in this region before the 19th century. The rise of Arab nationalisms, Palestinian and other, and the rise of Jewish nationalism, of Zionism. The third factor, and this is really important, it's not just the rise of Jewish nationalism or Zionism per se. It is, thirdly, the settler colonial methods employed by the Zionist movement to, and I quote, transform Palestine into the land of Israel. That's not my statement. That is a statement of Zev Jabotinsky, the founder of the most influential political trend in Zionism, the trend that has led to this Likud party, which has held power in Israel for most of the period since 1977. This is the movement of Menachem Begin, you may have heard of him, of Yitzhak Shamir, you may have heard of him, of Benjamin Netanyahu, you may have heard of him, and a bunch of other prime ministers of Israel. And that was something that Jabotinsky said was the objective of the movement that he was one of the heads of. I repeat, to transform Palestine into the land of Israel. Think about that. And the means that had to be employed in order to take a majority Arab country and turn it into a majority Jewish country and a Jewish state, which was the objective. So that was the third of the important factors that produced this war. The fourth is the stubborn resistance of the Palestinian people in various forms to these settler colonial aims and methods. That's why you have a war. Because you had imperialism arriving, because you had the growth of modern nation-state nationalism, because of the methods that Zionism used, settler colonial methods, to replace one people with another people. We've seen this happen. We are standing on land where this happened. Illinois, not an Anglo-Saxon word, you may have noticed. Chicago, Massachusetts. So think of those settler colonial projects in Australia and New Zealand, and the ones that failed in Algeria and elsewhere. And that is what you were talking about, replacing a people with another people. I also wanted to show, with the title and with the book, this war was not just between Zionism and Israel on one side, and the Palestinians on the other, with the Palestinians occasionally supported by various actors, Arab and other. It always involved, since 1917, the massive intervention of the world's greatest powers, whether that was the British Empire until World War II, or whether that was the Soviet Union and the United States, or Britain and France, or most importantly, since then, the United States. It always involved the massive intervention of these powers on the side of Zionism and Israel. These powers were never neutral. They were never honest brokers. They have always participated in this war alongside Israel. They were and are, still are, full parties to this war on Palestine. Israel did not fight the Palestinians with Israeli weapons. Every single Israeli warplane is American. We paid for them. My taxes, your taxes paid for them. Every single combat helicopter is American. Most of the 155 millimeter shells, most of the 2,000 and 1,500 pound bombs that were dropped on Gaza are American. Every Israeli tank, every Israeli armored personnel carrier doesn't have an Israeli engine. They manufacture the tanks. Who manufactures the engines? Rheinmetall in Germany. No German engines, no tanks. No American warplanes, no bombs, no civilian deaths. We are participating, we as a country are participating in this war, as Britain in a much earlier stage participated in this war, in the 1930s, for example. I'm not going to talk about that right now. Since the beginning of this war, which I would describe as one between an oppressed people and an oppressor, between a colonizer and a colonized people, because of this external support, there has never been an equivalence between the two sides, only a vast imbalance in every respect in favor of Zionism, and after 1948, in favor of the state of Israel. I use the terms settler colonialism and resistance because I thought it was absolutely essential to reframe events in Palestine in terms of this reality, rather than the prevailing fiction that this is just a conflict between two peoples or two national movements. It is that, but that's not all it is. It has a specific nature. This is not Germany and France. This is not two countries fighting each other. This is one people that was sitting there peacefully in its country and suddenly found another group trying to take it over. It has a specific nature, and that nature is a settler colonial nature. Of course, Zionism had and still has, Israel had and still has, both a settler colonial and a national aspect, like the United States. This is a country, we're a nation, we're people, but we are also the result of a settler colonial project, as is Canada, as is New Zealand, as is Australia. However, the essential dynamic in Palestine is and has always been of a settler colonial movement, based in and supported by Europe and the United States, trying to take over a country, Palestine, displace its indigenous population. In this sense, this is a war on Palestine, which is where the title of the book comes from. Moreover, every colonial conquest, without exception, whether standard colonialism as in India or Egypt, or settler colonialism as here or in Palestine, has always inevitably engendered the resistance of the colonized. Now, the colonizer can't allow it to be seen that this is legitimate. So the colonizer always codes this resistance negatively, whether it calls it banditry, that's what the British called armed resistance in India, whether they call it criminality, that's what the British called Irish resistance for 850 years in Ireland, whether they call it barbarism or terrorism, which is the terms of art for Israeli propaganda. Like other colonized people, the Palestinians have resisted their subjugation and their expulsion in a variety of ways, violent and non-violent. And that is the only way to code what is happening as resistance. It is resistance. And that's inevitable, necessary. It happens everywhere. It has always happened throughout the history of colonialism. Now, I illustrated this argument in the book, and I'm going to say a few things that I'm drawing from the book. In particular, by drawing on the writings of Zionist leaders. I talk about David Ben-Gurion, I talk about Chaim Weizmann, I talk about others, but I focus on Zev Jabotinsky because he was the most honest of them all. You will find Ben-Gurion and Weizmann in their private writings to other people and in their diaries saying almost everything I'm about to say. Jabotinsky was the one who said it out loud. Jabotinsky was the one who put it in his speeches. Jabotinsky was the one who put it in his articles, published articles. And so I'm going to quote things that he wrote in an article in 1923 and in other places to nail down this argument. He wrote in 1923, "Every native population in the world resists colonists." Smart man. That's what I just said. As long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. This is not some anti-Semite speaking. This is Zev Jabotinsky, the ideological founder of the dominant trend in Israeli politics to this day. The spiritual father of Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu's father was Jabotinsky's private secretary for a brief period. He went on. This is Jabotinsky again. "This is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing, as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel." That sums it up very well. Jabotinsky was thereby admitting that Zionism did not seek to share Palestine or to live in peace with the inhabitants of Palestine, but rather to transform it into its entirety, into Israel, into a Jewish state. And the aim was apparent, obvious from the very beginning. Theodor Herzl began his campaign, and he's the founder of modern political Zionism, with a book called Der Judenstaat, the state of the Jews. It wasn't the state of the Jews and the Arabs. It wasn't the state for everybody who lives there. It was the state of the Jews. And if you read that book and read his other writings, it's clear that that's what he intended. Israeli governments since then have been very blunt about this. In 2018, the Israeli Knesset passed something called the Nation-State of the Jewish People Law, which says that only Jews have the right of national self-determination. The current government of Israel's platform in 2023 stated that, or claimed exclusive national, claimed the exclusive national rights of Jews in the land of Israel, which for them extends from the river to the sea, and by some accounts, farther than that. If you listen to the account of our ambassador in Israel, he's sort of Israel's ambassador in the United States, in my view. But anyway, Mike Huckabee, that claim goes much farther to the Euphrates and the Nile. That's Mike Huckabee, not me. Our ambassador to Israel. And early Zionists always recognized that their movement had a settler colonial nature. They understood, they claimed that they had a superior right, but they always understood they were European settlers taking over a non-European land and transforming it. The major land purchase agency was called the Jewish Colonization Agency. This idea that a claim that Israel is a settler colonial entity is some kind of radical anti-Semitic slur is so idiotically ahistorical that you wonder if the people making it have ever read their own history, the history of Zionism, the history of Israel. It was always something that was understood among early Zionists. And the colonial nature of the thinking behind it could not be more apparent than from a statement by Herzl, who said that the Jewish state that he hoped to create would be, I quote, a wall of defense for Europe and Asia, an outpost of civilization against barbarism. That is how they saw the region they were coming into, and that is how they saw themselves. Enlightened Europeans coming to bring civilization to a barbaric land and a barbaric region. I'm going to quote, I'm going to test your patience because I'm going to quote Jabotinsky one more time. He said, again, this is an article he wrote in the 20s, Zionist colonization can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population. Think of the United States. Behind an iron wall, which the native population cannot breach. If you wish to colonize a land in which people are already living, you must find a garrison for the land, or find a benefactor who will provide a garrison on your behalf. Zionism is a colonizing venture, and therefore it stands or falls on the question of armed forces. Again, couldn't be more blunt, couldn't be more frank. The benefactor before World War II was Britain. The benefactor since then has been the United States. I honestly think that Jabotinsky says it all. I want to talk briefly about one more aspect of the book, and then I want to talk about a little bit about the current situation. I divided the book into 6 chapters, which I think cover both the most important events between 1917 and the time I published the book in 2020. And I'm just going to briefly mention the first and explain why I called them declarations of war. I talk in the first chapter about what I call the first declaration of war, which is the Balfour Declaration and the League of Nations mandate. And if you read the Balfour Declaration, you understand why I'm calling it a declaration of war. It said, it's one sentence, His Majesty's government view with favor, this is a letter written on behalf of the British cabinet to a representative of the Zionist movement, Lord Rothschild. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. The very terms of this are a declaration of war. The word Arab, the word Palestinian is not mentioned. The only group that has national rights, according to this declaration, is the Jewish people. The 94% of the population, the non-Jewish communities in Palestine are never mentioned except in terms of civil and religious rights. So Britain proposed to create a national home and to give political rights to a tiny minority, to bring in others to make them a majority, and to give the majority population no national rights and no political rights. That was a declaration of war. I argue in different chapters that other things done mainly by international organizations under the control of the great powers or by the great powers themselves can have to be seen as declarations of war. The Partition Resolution of 1947, UN Security Council Resolution 242 of 1967, the War on Lebanon of 1982. All of these things are driven by the great powers. They're not the actions of the Zionist movement or of the State of Israel in the first instance. The Israel didn't exist when the General Assembly decided to give most of the country over to the Zionist movement. It was the Americans and the Soviets who forced that resolution through the General Assembly. That was a declaration of war on the Palestinian people. They were the overwhelming majority of the country, most of which was being given to a minority by a decision forced through the General Assembly by the great powers. I could say that I could explain to you why I would argue the same thing to the other declarations of war as I described them. But let me move to more recent events. I think that all of the events that have followed the Hamas attack of October 7th of 2023 have confirmed every element of this book's thesis, with the imbalance of power between the two sides evident in the disproportionate levels of death, destruction, and displacement that have taken place since then. Many Israelis were killed. Many, many, many more Palestinians were killed. The ratio of Palestinians to Israelis killed is in excess of 35 to 1. Probably 36, 38 to 1. With the casualties we know right now, there are thousands more buried under the rubble. 35 Palestinians have been killed for every Israeli. And that is a ratio which I think shows you the imbalance of power. It shows you something else. It shows you that what has been done is not just retaliation for the attack that Hamas launched on the 7th of October. It's much more. It has to do with the very nature of the state of Israel, its settler colonial nature. I'll go into this in a minute. I could talk about other things to do with regard to casualties, with regard to levels of destruction. But I think we should focus also on the massive and unwavering level of US political, diplomatic, intelligence, and military support for Israel. This was not just an Israeli war on Gaza. This was an American-Israeli war on the people of Gaza. It wasn't just a war on Hamas. The best calculations of the number of combatants killed to non-combatants in Gaza is 1 to 5. 1 combatant for every 5 civilians. This is not just a war on Hamas. In fact, it was not mainly a war on Hamas. It was a war on the Palestinian people of Gaza. It's part of a much larger war that I argue goes way back over 100 years now. This is financed by us. The entire cost of that war was paid for by us, over $34 billion so far, and many more billions coming. I'm not even talking about the cost of the war that Israel and the United States are fighting today in Lebanon and mainly in Iran. This is also a war that was fought with the support of European powers, and I've already talked about where those weapons have come from. Now, this is a war that has been called a genocide by various international bodies, as well as by authoritative experts, many of them Israeli, on this subject. It's a legal term, genocide. I'm not a lawyer, but the lawyers that I think are respectable and are serious students of this, people like Omar Bartov, people like Raz Sigal, people like Dirk Moses, people who've worked on genocide, have been unanimous in calling it a genocide. So has every important international body that's looked into it. And as is clear, I think, if you look carefully at the statements by Israel's top leaders, there is no question that what Israel intended by killing so many people, by starving so many people, by destroying 85% of the built environment of Gaza, by destroying sewage plants, by destroying water pumping stations, by destroying hospitals, by destroying every single university in the Gaza Strip. was not simply retaliation for the 800 Israeli civilians that were killed on October 7th. It was much more. The intention was ethnic cleansing, which is a war crime. This is not just a war crime for which Israel is responsible. This is a war crime that the United States government connived in. Under President Biden, the White House Office of Management and Budget sent to Congress a budget request in October 2023, which asked Congress to provide money, which it did provide, to house Gazans outside of Gaza. Israel was going to kick them out. The United States was going to help pay to house them and take care of them after they were expelled. That is connivance in a war crime. Our government, has done this. Our government is responsible for this, as much as the Israeli government. I think that there's further proof of this. If you look carefully at the news from late October of 2023, you will see that Secretary of State Blinken toured 3 Arab capitals. He went to Cairo, he went to Amman, and he went to Riyadh. What did he do there? He asked those governments to connive in the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, to help the Israelis to expel these people and to allow them to enter their countries. Read the press for that period when Secretary of State Blinken was running around as an errand boy for Israeli genocide and ethnic cleansing. That's our government. That's not just Israel. That's our Secretary of State in the previous administration, not this administration, the Biden administration. To their credit, all 3 governments refused to accept to go along with the United States and Israel. As we can see from the current war with Iran, from the very beginning, this was always an Israeli-American war. Not just on the Palestinians, not just on Lebanon, on Iran and on other neighboring countries. Now, I want to conclude, after depressing you all with this historical background, by saying that there is actually one small source of optimism. If it's true that this is an American-Israeli operation, or an American-European-Israeli operation, and it has been since the beginning. This is not an Israeli project alone. This is not a Zionist project alone. This is not a project solely related to Palestine. This is a larger project. There is one small source of optimism. This is that U.S. support for Israel, public support for Israel, has collapsed over the past few years, both overall and among the young. This is true especially among young people, to whom enormous credit goes, because they've seen through the nonsense and the lies and the disinformation. But it's true among Democrats, it's true among independents, it's true even among Republicans. Support for Israel has gone down 10% among Republicans in 1 year. And it's been going down over the last several years. And it's going down even further since that poll took place a few weeks ago. It's a Gallup poll that took place in February. It showed that sympathy for the Palestinians for the first time ever was higher than support for Israelis. 41% of respondents supported Palestinians, 36% supported Israel, of Americans surveyed by Gallup in February. 3 years ago, it was the opposite. 54% of respondents supported Israel and only 31% supported the Palestinians. It's an amazing shift in literally 3 years. I would argue that Trump's illegal and unconstitutional war on Iran, together with Israel's war on Lebanon, a war that Secretary of State Rubio blurted out, perhaps inadvertently, that Israel precipitated, will only make things worse for Israel. And that means that there is some hope. If the American people wake up and recognize that this is not some bunch of people over there doing something to some other bunch of people over there. This is us doing this to them. And this is our tax dollars and so far our casualties. 7 American service people killed, 150 wounded so far. Then perhaps they will stop the support without which none of this can happen, which is going to force a change, which is going to hopefully force an end to this genocidal war on Gaza, force an end to this illegal unconstitutional war on Iran, force an end to the attacks that are going on every single day against Lebanon. I was speaking to a relative of mine today. He was offering me condolences on the passing of a relative. And I asked him, how are you doing? He says, well, they're attacking this neighborhood and that neighborhood, which are to the right and left of where his house is. Bashura and Za and Blat in downtown Beirut. And so we are doing this. These are our planes. This is our money. These are our bombs that are landing on Lebanon, that are landing on Iran. And I think Americans are finally beginning to wake up to the fact that we really don't want to support this war. Our war on Iran, American war, or Israel's war, which without us they could not fight. Thank you very much.
This feels like a big old family affair. Really want to echo thanks to Dina, to Amanda, to everyone at IRRPP, and to all of you for coming tonight. We are obviously in an incredibly stressful crisis of many different proportions in this country. And well, there's no one I'd rather talk about it with than my father. So here we are, maybe a little cringe, but we're embracing it. I asked Dina, are you sure you want this father-daughter combo? So, Rashid. I mean, we were talking a little last night too, but it feels like, you know, we're on the verge of dystopia here. I think Gaza is already there, complete collapse. With the AI revolution upon us, with nuclear war more possible than ever, with what's happening to Iran. And it feels like there's a sense of despair. How are folks feeling? A little despair sometimes? A little bit? A bit of a lack of hope after, certainly after 2+ years of this genocide, with the ridiculous things that Trump is doing and the kind of authoritarian takeover globally. I mean, I wanna ask you. I want to kind of go backwards in time and then kind of come to the present and maybe talk a little bit about the future as well. But I want you to reflect a little bit on your experience. You know, your book is unique among your books in that it brings in family experience and history and your own experience at various stages of the, 6 declarations of war, as you say, it makes it much more readable than some of your other more academic books. No shade. Hence, all of you should read it. But I want you to describe a little bit what it felt like in the 60s and the 70s at a time of revolutionary change all over the world, at a time of decolonization of Africa, Asia, other parts of the world, at a time of revolutionary change here in the United States. You were a student in the 60s at Yale. And then you lived in Lebanon through a good portion of the Civil War and through the U.S. Israeli invasion of Beirut. So can you describe a little bit what that was like? But really, I wanna hear what you felt like you were fighting for. What was the revolutionary hope that existed then? And what were you imagining was possible at that time?
Yeah, it's not the first time I've heard from members of my family at last, finally, I've written a book that's readable. In fact, her brother was after me incessantly, as were other members of the family, to write something that wasn't just meant for boring academics like me. What was it like? Well, I mean, as you said, it was a world at the time where there was a student movement in this country and in other countries, in France and many other parts of the world, against dictatorships in Latin America, against war in Vietnam, against racism in the United States, against imperialism. And, you know, we all felt we were part of a much larger movement, a much larger project, which not only hoped to end, you know, the war in Vietnam, which is what many of us were really focused on in the 60s, but also to change the nature of the United States. You know, the Civil Rights Act had just been passed, and you had people being lynched right up until, you know, I went off to university in the South. The United States was doing all kinds of dastardly things all over the world, overthrowing regimes and invading all of Southeast Asia, starting with Vietnam. And so we, you know, as far as Palestine was concerned, we felt we were part of a larger movement, which was gaining ground. I mean, we were in Beirut when the last American helicopters left Vietnam. And that was a moment of great relief to everybody. I mean, the United States has been forced to leave Vietnam, just as the French had been forced to leave Algeria in '62. And over that period, a number of countries had been liberated. So we had the hope that this wave would eventually reach Palestine and the region, the Middle East as a whole. It got harder and harder to hold on to that hope as things turned harder and harder for the Palestinian national movement, culminating, as you mentioned, in the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. She was a little girl, her big sister was a little girl, and my son was, when I was pregnant with my son at the time. And I describe all of this in the book, describing the invasion of Lebanon and the siege of Beirut and the massacres that followed it in Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. And I mean, that was a low point, actually, and the beginning of some very difficult times for the Palestinians. But I think up until that point, we had a sense that we were part of a larger global project, and that there were people who supported us all over the world, and there were. I've been very harshly critical of the PLO, but one of the things it managed to do was to have a kind of global outreach that gave the Palestinians allies everywhere, among liberation movements and among peoples. I mean, you would go to France, and there would be huge rallies in support of Palestine. France has shifted to the right since then, but we didn't feel we were alone, and there was an enormous sense of hope, right up through the 70s and into the 80s.
I mean, can you say more about what you imagined was possible at the time? I mean, did you think that the liberation of Palestine was going to happen in your lifetime? What was the vision for what was going to happen?
I don't think that we were as clear as we perhaps should have been about, and by that I mean not just me and my wife and our friends. I mean the movement as a whole, on what we wanted. At the beginning, when the PLO was taken over by the various movements that dominated it till this day, the objective was a secular democratic state for everybody, Israelis and Palestinians, Muslims, Christians, and Jews in Palestine. And I don't think we thought out any of the details of how we would get to that, because it seemed far off. But that was the objective. Over time, the PLO shifted to a two-state solution, a recognition of Israel and the establishment of a Palestinian state alongside it. Many of us were dubious about that, and many people were very supportive. The majority was supportive, as far as I can tell, of that as an objective. And I think that we saw in the negotiations I took part in in Madrid and in Washington from 1991 to 1993. I was an advisor to the Palestinian delegation that was negotiating with the Israelis. We realized, those of us who were negotiating, that this was not in the cards. Nor the United States nor Israel had any intention under any circumstances of allowing an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel. I could go into this if people want to, the chapter and verse of why we came to that conclusion. I believe that with an ironclad certainty. I mean, I was there. I was sitting there talking to Dennis Ross. I was sitting there talking to, I didn't talk to Rubinstein. It was the members of the delegation who was the head of the Israeli delegation. But I was writing up the memos. I was involved in this. And I can tell you, we were not allowed to even talk about statehood or sovereignty or borders or water or Jerusalem or refugees. We were allowed to talk about autonomy under Israeli control with the continuation of Israeli military occupation and with the continuation of the colonization of Palestine and the theft of land and so on and so forth. That was what was on offer. And that's what, to my regret, the PLO leadership accepted in Oslo, in which I was not involved. So,
let's turn a little bit to today. I think, in the last 2.5 years of this genocide in particular, we have seen, I think, an unprecedented mobilization for Palestine against the genocide. The student movement really was the vanguard and got global attention with encampments and sit-ins and marches, and it was also around the world that we saw some of the biggest marches ever for Palestine. And I think a lot of activists that I've talked to lament the fact that all of this mobilization and we couldn't stop the genocide, and yet, as you named, I think we've seen an incredible shift in public opinion. We have electeds now saying they won't take money from AIPAC, which is, I think a few years ago wouldn't have happened. And I think that is that is an opportunity for us, that is a source of hope. And at the same time, the backlash has been unprecedented. You from your perch in academia and me from my work, supporting the movement and challenging attacks on free speech and students in particular, we haven't seen this level of censorship since the McCarthy era, arguably, and
I think this is worse.
Yeah, worse in many ways, and more widespread in many ways. Just from our perspective, we had a 600-fold increase in intakes, legal intakes coming to us. People fired for as little as wearing a keffiyeh at work or having a watermelon sticker. The thousands of students who were arrested and brutalized, who were suspended or expelled or evicted, right, for standing up for Palestine. And that's not to mention the lawfare, right, the attack on universities in particular, and the kind of attempt to use the accusation of anti-Semitism to bully universities into clamping down on their students, cracking down on their students and professors. I want to, can you share a little bit of what it was like at Columbia in particular? I think that all that happened before January 2025, when Trump came back to power, laid the red carpet for Trump's agenda, right? He used these attacks on students, the attacks on universities, as a justification to enact his anti-intellectual, anti-DEI, anti-trans agenda, anti-dissent agenda. And I think Colombia was, number one, right, in capitulating. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that experience at Columbia over the last couple of years. You're now retired. But
Happily retired.
yeah, happily. And yet all your colleagues are still in the trenches, as are many of you here. So, what would you, how can we resist this, this really, steamrolling of academic freedom and free speech on campuses and this attempted strangulation, ideological strangulation of academia, really?
Yeah, I'm going to say a couple things before I actually answer the last question. The first is, you're absolutely right. Young people were in the vanguard. And I've seen this before. I mean, I remember the anti-Vietnam War movement. And it was students. And it was young people generally who drove it. Now, other people joined and other people were involved. There were older activists. There were many, many strata of American society. But it was the students who were the mother of war. It was the things that were being done on campus. And we now honor them because we all know the Vietnam War was a horrible, illegitimate, wrong thing. Columbia honors them. Columbia University honors the students who took over buildings in 1968. They did a good thing. Columbia says. The same university that prosecuted students for taking over building in 2024.
Same building, right?
One of the same, well, in 1968 they took over several buildings. But one of the same buildings, yeah, Hamilton Hall, Hind Hall, named for a young girl who was murdered by Israeli soldiers, together with her entire family. That's what the students named the hall when they occupied it, was Hamilton Hall. So that's the first thing. And that is not something that happened in the immediate aftermath of the 7th of October 2023. That shift had taken place among young people before that. And I can tell you that we noticed this way, way, way before. We noticed it when universities all over the United States, students at universities all over the United States voted to have their universities divest themselves from companies that support Israel's occupation of Palestine. That happened at Columbia, that happened at Brown, that happened at Michigan, that happened at universities all over the country. That happened in 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, long before this war on Gaza. So young people had already opened their eyes, had stopped reading the New York Times and the lying propaganda of CNN and Fox and CBS and NBC, and had figured it out. But by overwhelming majorities. The vote was more than 2/3 of students at Barnard and Columbia. And the votes were similar at Michigan and similar at many, many other schools. So this is a shift that was taking place at the grassroots of the student population long before 2023. It was driven partly by a shift in academia, by an understanding of things like the settler colonial roots of the state of Israel, of things like the fact that most of what people were writing about Israel was complete rubbish 40 and 30 and 50 years ago. Complete and utter rubbish. It was false, it was untrue, it was ahistorical. The desert was not made to bloom by Zionist colonization. Most oranges exported from Palestine up to 1948 were grown by Arabs. The desert was already blooming, in other words. I could go on every myth you've heard if you're old enough. If you're young, you probably didn't hear these, fortunately. But the point is, that's partly a change that has taken place in academia. Whence one of the elements of the attack on academia today. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is, yes, many young people were disappointed that 2 years of unprecedented activism on campuses, which helped to affect American public opinion in an entirely, in my view, positive way, did not lead to an end of this genocide. We did not succeed. They did not succeed. And that is awfully, terribly disappointing. In fact, it continues. Since the so-called ceasefire in October, almost 600 people 65 or 75% of whom are women, children, and old people, i.e. non-combatants, and half of the men are undoubtedly non-combatants, have been killed by Israel during a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. We haven't stopped it. And that's enormously disappointing and enormously tragic. But, I mean, if you have been there and followed these kinds of movements over time, whether it's the movements for ending the Vietnam War, whether it's the movement for ending the Iraq War, whether it's the movement against racism in this country, whether it's for trans rights, whether it's for LGBTQ plus rights, whatever it may have been, these things take a long time. They require building organization. They require not just activism, they require long-term hard work. Long-term is the key. It took, they started their war on Vietnam in the early 60s. The American Army left Vietnam in 1975. That's how long it took. The Iraq War, over 10 years. Any movement, the boycott and divestment movement over South Africa, it took 10 years. 10 years. And that is only one of multiple examples. And this is going to take time. In some ways, this is harder than Vietnam. There are not that many American soldiers being killed in this war. Now that Trump has gone and decided to attack Iran, we are beginning to see American casualties. But up until this point, Israel's war on Gaza has produced no American casualties. That's not like Iraq, and that's not like Vietnam. And those are among the things that turn American public opinion against those wars. So this is going to be harder. Now, what is to be done? And, I think that the way in which most of the student movements at most of the universities, including Columbia, that I followed, operated, is a clue as to how we should go forward. This was not just Students for Justice in Palestine who launched a campaign. Every single student group, with one or two exceptions at Columbia, every single one was part of a coalition. They all were on board. You have to have a broad coalition, because this is not just about Palestine. And I think that the offensive that the Trump administration has launched against universities is not even mainly about Palestine. It is about Palestine. It's also about everything to do with race, everything to do with gender, everything to do with diversity. I mean, I could go on and on. They're waging a multi-front war, and to oppose them, you have to have a coalition of everybody who's being attacked. Anybody who works on race. I mean, this institution is a target, as IRCPL, Institute for Race in Columbia, as are the area institutes at Columbia, as I could go on and on and on. Anything to do with race, anything gender, anything diversity is a target. And you have to put together a coalition which recognizes that. Because it is one, même combat, as the French would say. It's the same struggle. And that's not a roadmap for what to do. But I think that some of the, I'm exempting those who are present. Something that university administrators have got to do is to take their heads out of the sand and understand that what they are trying to do is reshape the entirety of higher education to fit a reactionary, authoritarian agenda, which is, and so the path forward is not just to say Palestine or these horrible wars the United States is waging in the Middle East, but that's linked to everything else that they're trying to do. And also the money that they are pouring into bombs and guns and planes is money that we don't have to repair the worst train service in the world, to repair our hospitals and our schools and our universities and our potholed roads. That's money that should be spent here on veterans, on hospitals, on people who need help in our society, on infrastructure, and not on needless, illegal, unconstitutional, immoral, imperialist wars.
I feel like since there's this awesome crowd, we should kind of have a huddle after and plot ways to challenge this. I'm going to take us a little bit. I know you always say I'm a historian, I can't predict the future, I get it. But maybe we can imagine a little bit. And again, I feel like with this room, there's a lot of imagining we could do. Gaza is ground zero. They have destroyed everything, but not the people. But there are still 2 million plus people, Palestinians living in Gaza in the most inhumane conditions. And, I keep thinking, what's our plan? What is our plan? We know Trump and company have a plan. The Board of Peace seems to have a plan. High-rises or Riveras or high-tech concentration camps to...
I think start with large profits for them. That's where it starts.
They are developers, first and foremost. I think Palestinians, we've been guinea pigs in a lot of ways for the high-tech war, and I read somewhere that they are training AI on the suffering, the suffering of Palestinians through this genocide, imagine. What's our plan? How can we imagine something else for Palestine, for Palestinians? And I don't think, it feels like this is really the biggest task for Palestinians, but for all of us, right? Like, what are we imagining the world could be, right? If we were to build it, what would it look like? Because we know that the Heritage Project 2025, they had a plan, they're executing the plans. But what's our plan, and how do we harness our collective imaginations to start thinking about that? And for Palestinians, it does feel like first order is survival, right? And yet, if we survive, we will survive. But to what, right? What can Palestine be if we don't imagine it? So I want to ask and talk a little bit about, can we imagine my children, your grandchildren, returning one day, and to what? To what can we return?
Those are big questions. I think it's all linked, obviously. Because to stop the genocide, stop the war, we have to make a change here. Palestinians can't stop the war. The undemocratic, feeble, illegitimate Arab governments can't stop the war. The spineless Europeans are not going to stop the war. The American people have to stop the war. I mean, really, it's an American war, and we have to stop it. And that's not going to, unfortunately, happen. We have to stop it. It's not going to happen quickly. These things are going to take a lot of work. And I don't think we're anywhere near the level that we should be in terms of mobilization and action against these wars. They're all linked. And envision a better future where a huge proportion of the money, the tax dollars we pay, go to creating horrible engines of destruction that are actually being used. I mean, the bomb that was dropped on Tehran the other day must have been a 20,000-pound bomb. They're getting to the level of tactical nukes if we don't stop them. We have to stop them. And that's the first, and that means saying something about war and something about American hegemony. I mean, we have hundreds of bases all around the world. Why do we need hundreds of military bases all around the world? Whose interest does that serve? And we're not asking those questions. We're not telling our politicians to ask those questions. And I think we have to ask those questions. That's at the macro level. At the micro level, as far as Palestine is concerned, a couple of things. I think one of the things that's going to be necessary for Palestine to be liberated is for some of the Arab countries to finally achieve democracy. These are countries that have really, in many cases, never completely freed themselves of the grip of neocolonialism. I mean, you go back to the 50s and 60s and they were supposedly independent, you had British and American and Soviet ambassadors telling the rulers what to do. And I don't think that much has changed in many of these countries. They do not represent the wishes of their people, most of these Arab governments. The governments of the Gulf, the government of Egypt, the government of Saudi Arabia, the government of Morocco, the government of Algeria. They represent the interests of a tiny clique of very well-to-do people with very large Swiss bank accounts who are doing what they're told, whether it's by Paris or London or mainly Washington. And that's not something we can affect directly, though we can argue against American hegemony, the way it's being exercised. But finally, Palestine. This is a question for the Palestinians. I mean, one of the things that I have written about is failures of Palestinian leadership over time, and the successes that the Palestinians have had over time. And I could go into this maybe in question and answer in Q&A, but one thing that's lacking right now is a clear vision of the future. How do Palestinians want to live in Palestine in the future with another people that has established itself there? And this is something that's very hard to say because I can only imagine how Native Americans said to themselves, how are we going to live with these white folks who are arriving here with their guns and their power? And it's not an easy question. South Africans have figured it out. The Irish have figured it out. We have to figure it out. We Palestinians. It's none of your business unless you're Palestinian. That is something we have to figure out. The Algerians did it in one way. That's not going to happen, I think, in Palestine. The Irish are doing it in another way. First instance of European overseas settler colonialism. 1169, the English started. And they haven't finished. They still control Northern Ireland. But the Irish are figuring it out. The South Africans are figuring it out. The Kenyans figured it out. And we have to figure that out. And it's obviously out for us and the Israelis, but there's a problem there. Because they're not, as I tried to explain, we're not arguing as between equals. We're arguing as between a situation of absolute supremacy and absolute subjugation, subordination. That has to change. That structure has to be dismantled. There will be no coexistence where one people has rights at the expense of another people. That is not a solution. And I can't stress that enough. And that's the situation today. One people has rights at the expense of another people. Now, I'm the first to admit that settler colonial projects can produce peoples. I'm talking to one right now. You all are, most of you are Americans. I'm an American. I was born here. I'm not a native American, but I'm a native New Yorker. But this is a settler colonial project, and there's an American people. And Native Americans have come to terms bitterly with that. And we have to come to terms bitterly with the fact that at our expense, another people has established itself in what we understand as our country. And how we live with them, especially how we live with them after what they have been doing to us most recently, these last 2.5 years, is not a pretty or easy question to answer. But it's something we all as Palestinians have to figure out. And it's something Israelis have to figure out. Do they really want to live by the sword forever and ever and ever and ever? That's what their government tells them. You will have to kill forever or you will never be secure. In fact, the most insecure place to be a Jewish person today is Israel. Think about it for 2 minutes. It was a project, among many other things, to provide security and safety for the remnant of the Holocaust, among many other things. Where is that security and where is that safety where everybody lives by the gun forever? So that's their question. We can't answer that for Israelis. But we can answer the question for ourselves. How do we want to live with these people? And it's not an easy question to answer. There's an enormous amount of bitterness, actually, understandably, on both sides. And I think that's the key question. But the answer is absolute and complete equality of rights. It's not just a matter of justice. Absolute and complete equality of rights. National rights, religious rights, civil rights, every kind of rights. You cannot have rights at the expense of another person. Those are not rights. That's supremacy. And that's what we have today. And that has to be ended.
Thank you. I think there's so much that like you said, we can't go back in time to 100 years ago and recreate what Palestine was. But there are elements that I hope we can carry into the future and really think about the role that borders play, the role that and all of this again is created by the imperial powers, right? So I guess we just have to defeat imperialism, guys. That's our plan. So I'm gonna read a couple of questions from the audience here. One, you kind of started talking about the states in the region, and this question is what is the role of other states in the region, like Turkey, Egypt, Iraq, etc., in reshaping the region? Can you speak to that again?
They're all.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of questions here. One is, the New York Times is a rag, so what else? What do you suggest as an alternative to staying informed while not being an academic? And what politicians are there out there who can help end U.S. support for Israel?
Let me answer those. Politicians out there. I think Dima pointed to a very healthy phenomenon, which is for the first time in American history, you have politicians who are actually saying, we will not take money from this specific interest group, which is saying, we won't take money from AIPAC. And this represents a sea change. And as far as this issue is concerned, I think that's something I would demand of every politician, whether they're running for dog catcher or municipal office or any other thing. You must not, absolutely must not take money from a lobby that represents essentially the interests of a foreign country as an American politician. I mean, that should just be absolutely unacceptable. They wouldn't admit to taking money from a Russian or a Cuban or an Indian or a Chinese or a Senegalese or whatever lobby, even if it was made up of American citizens. And they shouldn't accept money from a lobby which essentially represents the interest of a foreign state. And that should be an absolute red line. And God bless those politicians, whether honestly or dishonestly, whether hypocritically, or will stick to a pledge like that. Whatever they did in the past, if they'll do that, you sometimes have to get in bed with people you don't very much like in politics. And I may not like most of those politicians who took huge amounts of money from AIPAC in the past and will not today. Gavin Newsom said, oh no, I won't. Gavin Newsom took a ton of money from AIPAC. He's not forgiven, but that's still good that he said what he said. And that's one litmus test. I would also love to see some of them stand up on their hind legs and demand that U.S. law be obeyed. There are laws against the use of American weapons for any purpose outside of self-defense. How is the slaughter of 70,000 Gazans, at least 72,000 Gazans, at least 83% of whom are non-combatants, self-defense? Every weapon that was used is used in violation of the Leahy law. Stand up on your hind legs and say that law has to be implemented. And the American policymakers who allow that to happen are guilty of breaking the law. That's why every American policymaker talks about Israel as a self-defense. They have to say that. That's the way they stay out of jail, because they should be in jail because they allowed those weapons to be used for purposes in violation of the law. How about prosecuting the killing of American citizens who happen to be Palestinian Americans? They've killed a half dozen of them in the West Bank in the last 5 or 6 years. Absolutely nothing has been done to bring one of the murderers of American citizens in the West Bank to justice. And the spineless so-called diplomats who supposedly represent our country haven't done a thing about it, nor have the politicians. Now, there are dozens of senators, to their credit, who have demanded action on this. Well, where are the other 70 senators? And that's the kind of thing that politicians should be doing. Let me make my answers shorter. New York Times is a
Let me just plug that obviously there's a primary on March 17th, and we have some opportunities to bring in some really progressive candidates for really important roles. So yeah, go vote.
Very quickly, New York Times is a rag. What else? Look, the people who own these media don't love us. Bezos doesn't love us. The Ellisons don't love us. They love their money and they have their interests. And where CBS is going and where CNN will go and where the Washington Post has gone is going to be to continue the status quo of imperialism, of theft by the gazillionaires who own our country, and the foreign wars that they profit from. And young people don't pay attention to those media. They know better than I do what we should be reading and what we should be looking at. Alternative media, independent media, social media. A lot of it is bad and a lot of it is good, and you have to be very discriminating the way you are. I read mainstream media all the time. I have to. I have no choice. But I also read the other stuff. And you have to be very discerning when you look at it all. And that's the best advice I can give people. As far as the role of other states in the region, I think we may be coming to a point where people recognize that when they think that the United States is going to defend them, it won't. Whether you're Turkey or whether you're Saudi Arabia or whether you're Egypt, and that maybe it's time to stand up for the national interests of your own people. I don't know if we're there yet, but I think this absolutely insane, psychotic war on Iran should make people wake up. Nobody in the region will benefit from this, nor the Iranians, nor the people of the Gulf countries, nobody, nor the Israelis, nor anybody. This is a mad, mad, mad war. This is absolutely the dumbest war the United States is engaged in. And I oppose all of them. Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, and a lot of other small ones. But this takes the cake. And this may wake some of these somnolent leaders in some of these countries in the region to stand up and finally understand that they have to figure out how to fend for themselves and maybe get together and do something about that. I'm not sure that'll happen. I hope it will.
A couple of questions.
Yeah, there's a question here about talking about the West Bank a little bit, and also Palestinians in 48 in Israel, and how can we create solidarity among these, forcibly separated groups of Palestinians. Maybe speaking a little to the 2021 uprising and what that looked like as well, and what hope we have to do that.
One more.
There are questions here about the role of AI as well. I don't know if you want to speak to that. Yeah, the role of technology in the genocide and the role of AI as well in Iran. Let's go with those and then maybe close with one other thing.
Very briefly about AI and high tech. As you may know, the targeting that slaughtered 70,000 people in Gaza was AI targeting. There were no human beings involved. There were no checks. Anyone who was identified as affiliated with Hamas was targeted. And that meant the postman, the school teacher, anybody who received a salary from the government of Gaza was considered a combatant and a militant. And they and their family, and as many as 100 people, were targeted by AI. So when they destroyed a building in Jabalia at the very beginning and killed, we don't know how many, 100 or more people, they were after one person. That was AI targeting. Now, this is something that we as a people had better do something about, because they're not just using it for targeting people over there, they're using it for surveillance, or going to use it for surveillance here. The Pentagon is in a fight with Anthropic over this very issue, whether this stuff can be used not just in wars over there, but in surveilling us over here. So, it's one of the things that I think we should make our politicians fight. And, we want to stop them from taking money from AIPAC, we want to stop them taking money from the likes of Bezos and all the people who are involved in AI. A tall order, but it's something we really should be doing. About talking about the West Bank and Palestinians inside Israel. I was in Palestine in December, 3 months ago. And the most important impression I came away from, I mean, I was only able to travel a limited amount. I was only there for 10 days or 12 days, whatever. I was able to go a little bit to Haifa in the north. I was able to go to different parts of the West Bank, but I didn't get a chance to go very far. The degree of repression there, in the West Bank in particular, is phenomenal. I mean, every single village, every entrance to every village has a gate on it. And when they close it, as they're doing today and yesterday, nobody can move at all. You can't leave your village or your town or your city. And the surveillance is absolutely obtrusive. There are little surveillance things everywhere, and they have drones, and they have a database in which every single person in the West Bank, every single person in the Gaza Strip, and every single person in Israel is listed. And the degree of obtrusiveness of this is just extraordinary. At the same time, I had a feeling, just going past village after village, that there's no way they're going to uproot these people. They've been doing this to them since '67, and they're still there. There's a Palestinian majority between the river and the sea. The objective of this project was to get rid of those people. That's why they kicked 750,000 out in 1948. That's why they kicked out another 300,000 in 1967. That's why they were trying to force people out of Gaza during this genocide. And that's what they're still trying to do, and they have failed. They have failed. You still don't have a Jewish majority between the river and the sea. And so that is a testament to a kind of resistance that has nothing to do with guns. It's just sumud, what we call steadfast, just sticking to the land, refusing to leave, no matter what they do. And that has been the best weapon the Palestinians have had, actually. And I felt that even more inside Israel, when I saw what used to be villages and are now towns and cities, huge urban conglomerations, Taibi, Tamra, I could go on and on. There's dozens of them. There's no way those people are going to be uprooted. They have unleashed a crime wave on the Palestinians inside of Israel, which has killed 200 or 300 people every year. Murderous gangs with Israeli weapons, completely unmolested by the Israeli police. Nobody is prosecuted for killing a Palestinian. They're Arabs. These are not Israeli Jewish gangsters. These are Palestinian Arab gangsters, citizens of the state of Israel, using Israeli weapons, mostly weapons stolen from or sold by Israeli soldiers from Israeli military bases, using automatic weapons on individuals. And it's a if you know anything about the mafia, it's a protection racket. Everybody pays protection. Every business pays protection money. And if you don't, they blow up your car, or they shoot your dog, or they shoot at your house, or they kill you. They killed almost 300 people last year, and the death rate is even higher per capita so far this year. In spite of that, these places are thriving. I mean, I went and talked to my sister-in-law's brother, and he said, people just pay the protection money, and life goes on. What can we do? I could give you a joke that he told me, showing how people are managing. But it's in Arabic, it wouldn't make sense in English. But I won't. So what I would say is that the different parts of the Palestinian people have been purposely separated. The Gazans are separated from the people in the West Bank. The Palestinians in the areas under occupation, 67 occupation, West Bank and Gaza Strip, are separated from people inside Israel, Palestinians inside Israel, and they're all separated from Jerusalem. You almost can't get to Jerusalem. You almost can't get to Jerusalem. It takes hours to get to Jerusalem. My brother lives in Ramallah, and I was in meetings in Jerusalem. He had to spend 2.5 hours, 3 hours. When I lived in Jerusalem, it's a 20-minute drive to Ramallah, 25-minute drive at night. It's 2.5 hours if you can get through, and there are days you can't even move. But there's a sense of oneness among the Palestinian people. There's a sense of solidarity. And as you mentioned, there are episodes where everybody sort of rose up together, like in 2021. Each one suffers a different form of the same oppression. Obviously, Gaza is on another level of horror. They actually are trying to make life unlivable in Gaza. But they're doing that on a different scale in the West Bank. They've destroyed 3 refugee camps in the last 9 months in the northern part of the West Bank. They've just bulldozed. This is a technique they learned from the British, of course. The British did this in part of Jaffa in 1936. They just bulldozed a large part of the city, the old city. In fact, everything, this is the book I'm working on now, every single thing the Israeli army does, they learn from British counterinsurgency strategies. Every single thing they do, they learned from the British. What the British had been doing in India, in Egypt, in Iraq, in Nigeria, they taught the people who later on became the Israeli army to do. Every single thing, blowing up houses and so on. And the Palestinians are still there.
And so Jabotinsky, who is not in his ilk, have not been able to extinguish the spark of hope that we have and that we will continue to have as long as we can stay on the land. There is one final question for me about the work that we do protecting students on campuses and whatnot, and I guess I'll end here with a little bit of a note of hope. On a hopeful note, the extreme repression that we've seen, as I said before, has really been unprecedented, and it has had an effect on the student movement, but students are still organizing, they're still speaking out, and I think it just, we have to fight on every single front. What we're seeing on the legal front and in courts is that we have a leg to stand on. There's something called the First Amendment, right? And they're losing in court. The lawsuits that Zionist organizations are bringing against universities are losing. They are saying, they recognize that, this is free speech. This is, a kafia is not an anti-Semitic symbol, right? Or these chants for a free Palestine have to be protected speech, or else what is the Constitution? And we're seeing universities, courts really responding in ways that insist on upholding the First Amendment and free speech principles. So the courts certainly will not save us, right? They are institutions that are part of this status quo, but it is all to say that we have to fight on every front, and that's the case for professors who have to stand up for their students and fight for the academic freedom that makes their work possible, and it's the case for students who, many of whom have sacrificed so much in the last 2 years, right? But continue, and that's what we hear every day. Compared to what's happening in Palestine, compared to what we're facing, this sacrifice is nothing, and if we don't stand up, no one will. So that's, I think, the attitude that we all have to have today and every day, and get out there and, I think the unification of our struggles has to be at the forefront as well, right? So let's end there, and thank you all again for yeah, please.
Quick notes. You all stood up, and thanks again so much for this really wonderful conversation today. It's been such a joy to hear you both sharing all the amazing work you've been doing for all these years. We want to make a special thank you to the co-sponsors, including the Social Justice Initiative, the UIC Arab American Cultural Center, and the very recent Global Middle East Studies minor. So please, a great opportunity on campus to be learning and studying more. We also want to thank the UIC Women's Leadership and Resource Center for allowing us to borrow these chairs. So we have a nice spot for this. And of course, all of you for being a wonderful audience, and to the IRRPP staff who are around in various places. Reminder that on Sunday, Dima Khalidi and Rashid are going to be in conversation at Pilsen Community Books, so keep the conversation going. And then finally, last year when Miriam Kaba was here, she called on all of us to support organizations and efforts that are doing important work in the world. And for those of us in organizations to not be shy about asking for support. So I want to encourage you, if you were moved by today's event, to support some of the critical work going on in the world. And if you are so moved, you have the opportunity to support IRRPP by making a donation and getting a nice t-shirt out in the lobby. But in the meantime, please buy some books, have a little nosh, and renew your friendships that you started at the beginning of the event. So thanks very much. Bye.